Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 752 Outreach Lecture, Collaboration and Partnerships. So here are our weekly topics. Which types of relationships can archives engage in? What are some of the resources required for collaboration? What are some of the potential benefits and negatives of collaboration? And how can collaboration support archival advocacy? So we'll start by looking at the different types of relationships archives can engage in. I mentioned collaborations before, but I do want to point out that as the Zurich report that we looked at this week discusses, there's actually a whole continuum of relationships or types of relationships that archives can potentially be involved in. So it could be just as simple as making contact with someone, sort of the getting to know you, pretty superficial type of relationship. And then, of course, that can extend into cooperation, where maybe you work on some kind of exhibit together. Coordination, so an even deeper level of relationship where you're actively coordinating in a deeper way to address an issue or a need within your institution or within a few different institutions that are working together. Then we have collaboration, which results in a new product or process being created. And then finally, we have convergence, where services that different organizations were offering sort of converge into one entity that oversees those different services. And we'll talk a little bit more about these during this lecture. But again, a whole continuum that can result or that can begin with something that is fairly superficial and then can continue to develop and to develop and to develop until two different groups or organizations, it could either be within an institution or between an organization in one institution and an organization in another institution. It could be between an archive and a community group. You know, there are a lot of different sort of permutations of what archival relationships can look like. What I want to talk about is some of the factors that might shape what these relationships look like. And this is something that the Zurich article touches on. So the first one it touches on are relationships that develop to meet the needs of an audience. So an archive may see that their audience needs a service that the archive itself, for whatever reason, is not capable of offering, or at least offering as well as it would like to. And so it identifies potential partners, either again within the host institution the archive is a part of, maybe it's another archive at another institution, maybe it's a community group, and the archives may begin moving along that continuum that I just talked about. So maybe contacting a community group and saying, hey, you know, here's who we are, here's what we're interested in doing, here's the sort of type of relationship that we have in mind, and then maybe the archive and the community group start coordinating a little bit, and then the relationship can continue to progress. Or it may not get beyond the cooperation or coordination point. You know, not every relationship is going to evolve into a true collaboration or a point where, you know, the services of two institutions are converged into one entity. But meeting the needs of an audience is obviously something that archives are concerned with or should be concerned with. And again, archives may choose to address their needs when it comes to meeting the needs of an audience through a relationship. Of course, that implies that the archives know who their audience is and the different types of services that the audience wants, right? If you have no idea what your audience wants, then it's going to be difficult for you to even know who to begin having a relationship with in order to meet the needs of that audience. So, you know, this is predicated on the notion that archives actually know who is using their materials or perhaps who isn't there using their materials, that they would like to use their materials, finding out what kinds of services those potential researchers or current researchers would find desirable and useful, and then the archive developing a relationship to help meet those needs that the audience or potential audience has. And archives may have to think strategically about this. You know, archives may have to realize that they can't meet the needs of every audience member, but perhaps there's a certain type of researcher that is particularly important to the archives or to the mission of the archives. And the archive may look at that audience first and say, well, this is really a very important audience for us. That's a very important group of researchers or potential researchers. So let's start looking at how we can collaborate with other entities in order to meet the needs of this certain set of researchers and, you know, potentially not worry about the needs of other researchers as much. So, you know, there's generally going to be some kind of pragmatic decision making that goes into this and some choices about which audience archives are going to strive the most to meet the most completely. It's just, you know, archives can't be everything to everyone, and they have to choose which audience to focus on. And again, meeting that audience's needs can be done through collaboration. Another factor that the Zork report mentions is other institutions. So if archives see other institutions, peer institutions engaging in certain types of relationships, then that may inspire the archive or make the archive feel compelled to do the same. You know, if you are a university archive and you see collaborations that other university archives are engaging in or collaborative projects that they're involved with, you may think, well, that's something that might be beneficial for us to do, so let's explore making this type of a relationship happen. You know, it might be a little bit of kind of keeping up with the Joneses and feeling kind of peer pressure from peer institutions to be involved in certain types of collaborations, just so you can have a good reputation in the field and so on. But certainly, if archives look around and see other types of collaborations and relationships that are going on by other archives, that may serve as an inspiration or a catalyst for archives to try and engage in, you know, at least generally speaking, the same type of relationship. Obviously, the exact relationship is going to differ from archive to archive based on access to resources and things like that, which of course we'll touch on later on in this lecture, but just sort of seeing what other archives are up to might serve as a catalyst for archives to engage in certain types of relationships. Another factor that the Zork chapter or report mentions is the expectations of funding agencies. So the report touches on more and more granting agencies want to see institutions receiving grants to be involved in collaborations or relationships with other organizations or institutions or community groups. So that may pressure archives to not only engage in relationships in the first place, but might shape the exact nature of that relationship, according to what granting agencies want to see happening within archives that receive grant funding. So yeah, that's an overview of, generally speaking, the different kinds of relationships that archives can engage in and some of the different forces or catalysts that might lead archives to engage in a variety of different relationships. So next we'll talk about some of the resources that are required for collaboration, or some of the resources that are required for relationships that the archive may engage in more generally. I have collaboration here, but as I just talked about, these relationships might not necessarily progress to the point of collaboration. So that's just an important thing to kind of consider and keep in mind. So here is our list of different types of infrastructure from the Heckman book. You've probably got this more or less memorized by now, but I do think it is a good thing to kind of revisit because I feel like this list is a good representation of the different types of infrastructure that archives may possess and do need to be successful. So it's interesting to look at some of the different types of resources involved in collaboration that the Zurich Arctic chapter report mentions and connect them to some of the different types of archival infrastructure that we have discussed in this course. And one thing that I do want to mention, and you might have seen this on the collaboration continuum or relationship continuum diagram that I had in previous slide, which comes from the Zurich report, that as archives move into deeper relationships with other institutions or entities, the investment of resources becomes more involved. It takes more resources to pull off a true collaboration with another entity than it does, to coordinate or collaborate on an exhibit or a workshop or something that is less intensive. And we'll talk about some of the issues that can be associated with that increasing level of involvement and increasing need for resources as we move through that progression to more of a collaboration or convergence type of relationship. We'll just touch on that again later on in this lecture. And there are more connections that you can make between the different types of resources involved in collaboration and other types of relationships than what I'm going to touch on here. I don't want to keep you listening to this for the rest of your lives or all night, so I'll just touch on a few, but there are definitely more connections that you can make. But I just pulled out some of the examples that I thought were particularly interesting and particularly relevant to some of the things that I've talked about in this course already. Okay, so the first one that we'll talk about is placement of the archives within the organization. And I connected this with the idea of mooring that the Zurich report touches on, this idea that if a relationship that an archive has or an archive is trying to develop is placed within the existing administrative structure of the organization that the archive is a part of, then it's more likely to be successful because it's more likely to have a steady access to resources. It's not something that is going to be kind of on the periphery of the institution that the archive belongs to, but it is going to be part of an existing committee or part of an existing department or other administrative body within the archives organization. And as the Zurich report mentions, that can result in archives being less dependent on sort of startup funds and resources which may peter out over time, which can impede the ability of the relationship to be successful and can impede the ability of the archives to communicate the value of a relationship to its hosting institution. So if your collaboration exists on the periphery and as kind of this voice in the wilderness, then that can make it more difficult for your archives to point out the successes that your relationship is having and how it's contributing to the overall goals of the institution that the archive is a part of. And of course, connecting the fruits of a relationship to the overall goals of an archives institution can be a really great way to highlight its impact and the positive value that it's having within an institution. And to a great extent, the ability of the archives to do this depends on the archives having a archival relationship, having a good mooring within its host institution, and having access to the resources that can result from that mooring. The next one that I'll talk about is relationships with other individuals and organizations. I connected this to technology, which is something that the Zurich article discusses as a resource that is necessary for collaborations to be successful. It's always really helpful to have the support of your IT department or maybe the support of an IT department at an institution that you're partnering with to make collaborations successful. If your institution is trying to unify, the catalogs or digital collections of, a few different archives and maybe also a library and a museum, that's something that can take a certain level of technical prowess, and it may be beyond the skill set that the archive itself possesses. And so having that support from IT can be extremely beneficial, and having access to the infrastructure, the knowledge, the expertise, the staff that IT departments can provide can make the success of a collaboration or success of a relationship more likely. Of course, this assumes that the IT department that your archive has access to or is working with itself has solid infrastructure. And the Zurich article touches on a couple of examples where archives wanted to engage in collaborative relationships, but they just didn't feel that their IT resources were up to snuff. And so they didn't think it was going to be a fruitful effort, and that served as a barrier between them and collaborating as much as they would like. So having access to this technology expertise and know-how can be very beneficial, especially again if you're trying to collaborate in a way which involves computers and software and programming and other more technical aspects. Okay, so the next one that I'll touch on is holdings. So the collections that an archive possesses, that can, first of all, serve as a basis for collaboration. If you don't have holdings that allow you to have some connection or some relationship with another archive or another organization that may either have similar holdings or have some expertise or experience with the holdings that you have, then that's going to close the doors on a lot of potential relationships that your archive might engage in. And so a good example of this is in the reading for this week, which talked about the Bangor University Archives and Special Collections, the Penryn estate records that they had, and how that served as a catalyst for the collaboration that Bangor University's archives had with the ISWE, so the Welsh Estates research group that was really interested in providing more information about estates in Wales. And what was especially beneficial about the Penryn collection is that given the multidisciplinary nature of the records, it was useful for developing local, national, and internationally based programming. So there was not only a basis for a relationship and collaboration, but a basis for quite a high degree of collaboration as well. So the ISWE could use the Penryn collection to discuss a lot of the connections that Welsh estates had with things like slavery. They talk about some local history related to a strike. So just the nature of this collection allowed a lot of collaborations to take place that maybe would not have occurred if this collection didn't have such a diverse content and diverse records inside of it. Another interesting thing to consider is how the absence of holdings may lead to a collaboration or a relationship as well. So here I'm thinking of the chapter that we read for this week, wherein the Rare Book Special Collections and Preservation Department at the University of Rochester was interested in partnering with community organizations in order to what they perceived as shortcomings in their archives. So they realized that they had all of these collections related to social justice and human rights, but none of them were from the perspective of people who actually experienced homelessness. And so they used that as a catalyst to want to collaborate and have a partnership with organizations in Rochester that would allow them to fill that gap and have the voices of individuals that were unhoused represented in the special collections. And so that was the basis of the collaboration that they undertook. So I would say in most instances, having collections in the first place is going to be kind of the main resource that is going to make collaborations more likely to occur and perhaps result in relationships developing that are going to be more fruitful and easier because you kind of already have what you're wanting to collaborate with. But the University of Rochester example is certainly an interesting example of, okay, well, we don't have this in our archive, so let's collaborate with community groups, let's partner with them to try and address that. So there are a couple of different ways that holdings can serve as sort of the impetus for collaborations taking place. Okay, so next I'll talk about freedom of action. So kind of the other side of the placement of the archives within the host institution. And I connected this with the idea of opportunism. So the ability for archives to develop relationships in ways that they think are best or that they see fit. and ideally in ways that have a greater ability to meet audience needs and ways that develop more of a foundation for a successful relationship. So if the archive has a lot of freedom to say, we feel like this is a useful partnership for us or a useful collaboration, and they don't have to have a lot of people kind of overseeing that and getting in the way and saying, well, you can have this relationship, but it has to, fit this very specific box, then they have a lot more flexibility in what that relationship looks like. And assuming that the archive knows what its goals are or that they know what their audience needs or what they're trying to accomplish, that can give them more flexibility as far as achieving those goals and meeting the needs of the audience that they have in mind. And kind of reading through the lines, it seems like the University of Rochester was uh, was aware of the freedom that they had to pursue partnerships with uh, individuals who were unhoused and advocacy groups for unhoused individuals in Rochester. But they're also aware that what they were doing might not necessarily have the support of the institution, 100%. So, freedom of action is great, but at the same time, if you're engaging in partnerships and using the resources and other time and staff and some of the resources that we've talked about to pursue them, you have to kind of think about the potential political ramifications as well, right? No unit within university or within organization has complete freedom of action, and you do have to be aware of the opinions of stakeholders and other people that might have some say in the resources that your archives has access to in the future when you are deciding what kind of relationships you want to engage in and how you're going to go about achieving your goals. I think a lot of this goes back to trust. Do stakeholders trust that archives are going to engage in relationships which are beneficial for the institution or for the corporation? Do they trust that archives are going to uh, use the flexibility and opportunism that they have to make the right choices and be successful? And again, this trust only comes from one place, and that is through outreach and advocacy. So having this freedom of action and being able to take advantage of opportunities that you see for potential relationships, the freedom to do so is going to come from having people above your archives in your archives organization that trust you and believe that you're competent and believe that you are going to do the right thing with the resources that you have, with a minimal amount of supervision. Okay, so the last one that we'll talk about is staff. And an interesting one that the Zurich report mentions is this idea of change agents. So people who are going to be the ones who are able to direct resources to a relationship, are able to, you know, keep the trains running on time, essentially. Keep relationships focused, again, provide resources to sustain relationships and really push these relationships forward. So typically, this is going to be someone who is, higher up on the food chain, someone who the archive can rely on as an ally, as an advocate, someone who, knows what strings to pull and how to pull them. And these change agents can be really valuable tools for making relationships more successful. Obviously, it's more important to have change agents the further along the continuum of relationships that you get. If you're just trying to coordinate on an exhibit or a workshop or something like that, having these change agents might not be as necessary because you're not necessarily going to use or need the same level of resources that you would if you are trying to pull off, something more complicated like a collaboration or a convergence. But, it's always useful to have that ally and that advocate that you can count on, whether that person is within your organization or perhaps it's within the organization that you're partnering with. It's always helpful to have that go-to person that can get you the resources and the support that you want. And again, having access to these change agents, having these allies and these advocates in place to help you is only going to come through advocacy, right? Through convincing them that what your archive is doing is worth them putting their time, maybe their reputation on the line, and stepping in to help you when your archive needs help. Okay, so again, these are just a few examples of how the presence of infrastructure can play into developing these relationships. There are a lot of other kind of permutations and examples of what these connections might look like. But again, I don't want to keep you here all night, so I just wanted to focus on a few that are maybe a little bit atypical, but nonetheless important understandings and connections to make. Okay, so next we'll talk about some of the potential benefits and negatives of collaboration, or really any type of relationship. And since I'm an optimist, we'll start by looking at some of the potential positives that can come from relationships between archives and other entities. So the Zurich report talks about increased access through merged data. So talking about the University of Edinburgh's federated search model, how all these different institutions came together and sort of merged their data so that a researcher could come in and search through all these different information resources, without having to go to each and every one of them to find what they're looking for. Ideally, they can just search, and then that will search all the holdings of these different institutions within the University of Edinburgh. So that's beneficial for the archive because, as we'll talk about later, ease of use promotes more use, and it's beneficial for the researcher as well, right? Because they have this sort of efficient overall searching option instead of having to go through all these different institutions and organizations to find what they're looking for. The Zurich article or chapter report, I'll get that right on the first try one of these times, report also talks about economies of scale. So if you are able to collaborate with another institution or organization and maybe pool your resources to buy more server space or collaborate on providing resources in a way that is more efficient than if each of you were tackling a resource on your own, maybe it could be something like security, then that's going to result in your archives, at least ideally, having resources that they could spend on other things. Maybe you spend less on digital preservation because you're collaborating with another institution, and that allows you to spend more staff time and other infrastructure on things like arrangement and description or appraisal. An interesting positive that can come from collaboration is something that the Haunton article touches on. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but that article talks about how if archives collaborate with public historians, that can result in outreach and public involvement that is actually better. So the article makes the connection between exhibits and workshops and social media as being examples of public history, and it suggests, so why are archives not working with public historians to make sure that things like social history or social media and exhibits are being done in a more ethical manner? So being done in ways that acknowledge um, the partiality of the content that researchers are seeing, that the public is seeing, being done in a way that is more transparent, so viewers understand, that records may not always be correct, that the archive, has to kind of choose a particular perspective to put in an exhibit. And I think that there is a lot of value to that. If archives are putting out exhibits and social media and other outreach tools that we've talked about in a way that is extraordinarily biased, potentially even uh, racist. Thinking back to an exhibit that we touch on in my 650 course, then that can be incredibly harmful for the archive and its reputation. And so, if there is a relationship between archives and public historians, maybe experts in the field, that an exhibit or a social media post or a workshop is related to a public history product, then archives have an additional perspective, and and that can just allow their outreach efforts to be more effective, maybe more appealing to the public, and that can certainly be beneficial for archives that are trying to turn people into potential researchers in archives and potential advocates in the future. Another positive thing that can come out of relationships that archives can engage in is coordination. So the Zurich report talks about the Yale Federation of Collections, which would be different administrative bodies within Yale University that would brainstorm on how to use collections to meet the needs of the university. So archives may have these collections, but not really know the best ways that they connect to what Yale is or was trying to do as a university. So the different learning outcomes that Yale wanted its students to meet and achieve. And if you have other people within Yale looking at these collections and saying, okay, well, we feel like we can connect this collection with this learning outcome, that may not be something that the archive had understood or thought of before. And so that can just open up another avenue where archives can say, okay, our materials are being used to support the mission of Yale University, and that's why we should be supported. So again, it's having this additional perspective, kind of looking at what archives are doing and what archives are offering and saying, well, here's how we might use this in a way that is going to be more beneficial for your archive and for the university as a whole, which is certainly a good thing. I mentioned before how if archives enter into relationships, they may be more likely to receive grants, and how granting agencies look for recipients that collaborate and have relationships with others. Again, this is something that the Zurich report mentions. The Evans article talks about how collaborations can lead to more recognition of archival impacts on the interpretation of records. So again, looking at the example of the Bangor University Archives and Special Collections and the institute that was studying Welsh estates. And this collaboration helped the archives again, align their special collections with the institutional goals of Bangor University. And it also increased the ability of the archive to demonstrate its contributions to core academic priorities. It increased the promotion of collections via research, teaching, and public engagement programs that the ISWE was involved with. And that certainly raised the archive's profile with not only external researchers and users, but internal researchers as well, and resulted in an overall improved relationship with academics. Again, both within Bangor University and in the greater public as well. And what was interesting is the Evans article talks about how the relationship that the archive had with the ISWE led to more resources being able to support the care of the Penryn collection. So there was a situation where the archives didn't have the resources to take care of the Penryn collection as well as maybe they should have. There was a time where it looked like that collection might actually be taken away from them. I don't really understand the context of why that was going to occur. Something to do with taxes. I, I don't know the background from that perspective, but yeah, essentially that collection was going to be taken care of them because the archives hadn't provided the level of access and care to the Penryn collection that that was felt appropriate. And so this relationship with the ISWE and the improved publicity around the collection allowed them to have more resources to take better care of that collection. So the Evans article talks about the ISWE writing letters of support for granting agencies when the Bangor University Archives was trying to get resources to take better care of the collection. And that was certainly a valuable resource. So just to give you an example of some of the positive related to collaboration relationships and how these relationships can be beneficial for archives. Of course, there can be some potentially negative impacts and outcomes from relationships as well. I talked about how as archives move along this relationship continuum from just having simple contact to a potential partner to having a convergence or a collaboration, there's a greater level of resources involved, and there's also a greater level of risk as well. You know, if you are engaged in these relationships and they get more and more complex and more complicated, and you and your staff are having to spend more time working on them, if for whatever reason that relationship falls apart or that relationship fails to meet its goals, then you know potentially you might have plowed a lot of resources into something which at best isn't going to help you, and at worst might actually result in a loss of stature among your peers and stakeholders. It might result in a loss of trust in your archives, a loss in the valuation of your archives and sort of how it's contributing to the overall mission of whatever institution the archive is a part of. And obviously, this can be a pretty disastrous outcome, right? If you've been involved in this relationship for months or years and it kind of falls apart, and maybe it's not even your archive's fault, then it's possible that you just spend a lot of resources on a big bag of nothing, a nothing burger, as people like to say, and that's certainly not beneficial for archives, which oftentimes need every penny that they can get a hold of just to keep things running as well as they should be. So obviously not an ideal outcome. You can negate this somewhat by, first of all, knowing who you're getting into a relationship with. Um, trying to have some idea of who within an organization you might be working with, knowing the different resources that your potential partner might be able to bring into the relationship. So, you can negate these risks somewhat, but, stuff happens and, maybe you think you have X resource at a partner institution and, maybe someone gets fired or a budget gets cut, someone resigns, you know, the 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 carpet can be pulled out from underneath you pretty quickly. So, it's always a consideration that archives have to make. The Zork article talked about a potential loss of identity. If our archive isn't engaged in digital preservation because now we are involved in this collaboration or this convergence and other people more or less take care of it for us, are we really archivists? But the Zork chapter report, that's one of those, right? Describes how this may be offset by an increased ability to focus on what is done well. So it's something that I talked about before. Okay, we're not doing digital preservation anymore because we have collaborated to the point where that's taken care of by a whole new entity that we helped create. So let's focus more on appraisal or focus more on arrangement and description. And you can connect this potential loss of identity to having a partnership that involves shared authority, which is something that the Hunton article discusses. So if archives are engaged in a partnership where they're saying it's not going to be us that are providing all the arrangement description for records or all the appraisal for records or making all the preservation choices about records, but rather it's going to be members of a community or members of society, that might result in an archive saying, okay, well, if we're not the ones in charge anymore, what's going on here? Are we still an archive? What's happening? Relationships can always be scary, right? Um, relationships can always lead to a loss of identity, right? It's kind of funny how these relationships between uh, different organizations can mirror relationships between people. Um, so as an archive, you just have to be cognizant of what you might be losing by sharing authority, but also what you might potentially be gaining from it as well. Okay, we're not in charge anymore, but also we can show that we are collaborating with the community, we're working with the community to provide arrangement and description, which is maybe more sensitive and more balanced. And, that's certainly a positive thing that archives can point to, as well as something that can come from these types of shared authority relationships that the Hunton article suggests are uh, important types of partnerships and relationships that archives can engage in. Another thing that I'll touch on is the potential of unequal relationships. And maybe an instance where an archive gets into a relationship with another entity, and maybe not at first, but over time, that entity becomes the one that's sort of calling all the shots and making all the decisions, and the archives kind of lose their place at the table and they're just more or less along for the ride. And as an archive, you always want to enter into a relationship where you want to feel like you're being respected, that you're going to be respected, uh, because you don't want to be seen or you don't want to feel like you are just sort of this minor partner and you can't really articulate your needs and how you feel a relationship could progress. because that can result in something that may be beneficial for one part of the relationship, but not beneficial for the other part of the relationship or other parts of the relationship. So that can be a potential negative repercussion as well. Again, if archives kind of know who they're getting involved with, um, this danger, this potential negative can be negated somewhat. But again, things can change and it's definitely something to kind of keep track of as the relationship progresses. The same with people, right? I hope that all of you, if you're in relationships, you feel like your relationship isn't unequal and that you can sort of speak up and have your own identity and assert yourselves when you need and want to, because it's just healthy, right? It's healthy for people and it's healthy for archives. It's healthy for having a sense of self-esteem and self-respect. And these are really good things. So just something to keep in mind, whether you are pursuing an archival relationship or an interpersonal relationship. Okay, so next we will touch briefly on how can collaboration or again other relationships support archival advocacy. I touched on a few ways already. So increased access, which I touched on, can result in more uses of materials. Efficiency resulting from these economy of scale relationships can please stakeholders. I talked about the value of being able to have more of a connection between archival materials and institutional goals, which can result from collaborations. I talked about having outreach efforts that are more transparent, that are done in a more ethical manner. That can result in archives being perceived in a more positive light, which can certainly uh, better the chances an archive has of developing advocates. Just sort of overall, if an archives is able to enter into a relationship and have that relationship be successful, it speaks a lot to the capacity and the competence of that archive. To go into this potentially complex process where you're sort of merging services with another entity or working with another entity, even on something like an exhibit or a workshop, it just sort of overall supports the sense of the archives as being competent and worthy of continued support. And we talked about at the beginning of this lecture about how, honestly, the best way to gain advocates is to just be competent, to do your job well. And relationships, especially more complex relationships, as we get further to the right of the continuum, demonstrate the ability of the archives to be successful and to do their jobs well, which is something that can resonate with stakeholders who are deciding whether to support the archive or not. And as you move through these relationships, again, whether they're fairly superficial or more complex, that results in you and your archive working with more people, right? As you're collaborating with people, maybe you meet people within that organization, maybe potentially other organizations as well. And that just sort of can deepen the roster of potential advocates that you have for your archive in the future. So it can prevent a situation where you more or less have all of your advocacy eggs in one basket, and it can result in a situation where you just have more people who could potentially be advocates for you in the future, which is always beneficial. I don't know about you, but every time I see this picture, I can like hear the music in my mind, and yeah, Dirty Dancing, boy, to be held aloft by Patrick Swayze, in the 80s. What greater joy could a person ever hope to experience? I truly don't know. Okay, and finally, and I'm sure that you might have seen it coming, but we'll circle back more to what are some of the resources required for collaboration and resources related to, say it with me, evaluation. you have to know why you're getting into a relationship with another entity. You have to know what you want to get out of a relationship with another entity. And as the relationship progresses, you have to know if what your goals and your ideas, if they're being met, if your needs as an archive are being met by the relationship that you've entered into. And if the answer is yes, great, keep it going. If it's no, okay, what can we do to maybe make this relationship more equal? What can we do to tweak things so that the needs of our audience are being met more thoroughly, or the needs of a funding agency are being met more thoroughly? How can we sort of adjust things as we go along? And it can be a difficult progress or process because, when you're working with another partner, anytime you want to change something, they have to more or less agree to it or not agree to it. And so, your freedom of action to kind of tweak things on the fly might be reduced somewhat, but it's always still valuable to have that introspection and to think, okay, is this still working? Is this still working? If not, why is it not working? And what can we do to change that and to make this relationship more reflective of what we as an archive want and need? And if you're not doing that, if you're just kind of going along and along and along, maybe things aren't going well, but you feel like, well, this has already gone so far. We don't really want to sort of rock the boat and try and change things. That can result in some of the more negative outcomes coming from relationships that we touched on, and can potentially make some of the more positive outcomes less likely. So you always want to have that introspection and that sort of understanding of if your goals and needs are being met or not, and okay, well, what can we do? What can we do about it? So again, true for archival relationships, and of course, true for interpersonal relationships as well. So I want you all to be involved in healthy relationships, whether they come from a professional or personal perspective. And so, yeah, having goals and having an idea if your needs are being met or not are certainly is certainly relevant to both types of relationships, and I hope that it's something that you keep in mind. Okay, so that's it for this week. Um, yeah, collaborations can be really great for archives. Relationships can be really great for archives. They can provide access to a lot of infrastructure and resources that archives may not possess. But they do come at a cost of risk. They do come at a cost of resources. And so, as with all the other outreach activities that we've talked about in this course, it's essential that you have goals and that you are evaluating whether or not those goals are being met as you continue being involved in relationships with other entities. Uh, so kind of a continuation of things that we've talked about in this course already, but definitely still vital and still relevant. So thank you as always for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions.